I am Thomas Gallagher, 71 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my own flesh and blood inflicted. As a retired construction contractor, I thought I had built a solid foundation for my family, but I was wrong. Last month, I drove 6 hours to attend my son's wedding, only to find out I was deliberately erased from the guest list. I didn't scream. I didn't cause a scene. I simply walked away. The next morning, I logged into my bank, canceled the $12,000 monthly mortgage payment I was making on his mansion, and waited. A month later, he texted me complaining that the mortgage was due. No apology. No explanation. I simply replied with a dinner invitation. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Syracuse, New York, meant understanding the value of a dollar and the biting cold of a long winter. For 40 years of my life, I woke up before the sun, put on heavy work boots that never quite dried out from the snow, and spent my days with a hammer in my hand and sawdust in my lungs. I built my contracting business from absolutely nothing. I poured concrete-framed houses and shingled roofs until my hands were permanently calloused and my knees ached with every step. I did it all for my wife, Sarah, and our only son, Derek. I wanted Derek to have the life I never had. I wanted him to have soft hands, a sharp mind, and a future where he never had to worry about how the bills would get paid. Sarah and I sacrificed everything to send him to a prestigious university. We drove old cars, took no vacations, and lived in the same modest 3-bedroom house we bought in our 20s. We watched with immense pride as Derek graduated with honors, moved to the city, and entered the fast-paced world of finance. But as he climbed the corporate ladder, a distance began to grow between us. He started wearing suits that cost more than my first truck. He started using corporate jargon we did not understand, and his visits home became shorter and less frequent. Still, Sarah and I never complained. We told ourselves that this was the price of his success, that he was simply busy building his empire. 4 years ago, the foundation of my world collapsed when Sarah passed away from a sudden illness. The grief was a heavy, suffocating blanket that I thought I would never escape. In her final days, holding my rough hand in her fragile ones, she made me promise to look after our boy. She told me that Derek was still young, still finding his way in a ruthless world, and that he would need my support. I promised her I would do everything in my power to ensure his happiness. That promise became my anchor. It became the only reason I bothered to get out of bed in the morning. A year after Sarah died, Derek introduced me to Valerie. She was a 30-year-old woman who came from a wealthy Manhattan family. Her parents, Winston and Patricia Kensington, were part of the elite circle that Derek was so desperately trying to break into. Valerie was beautiful, but she had a coldness to her, an obsession with social status and appearances that made me deeply uncomfortable. She looked at my calloused hands and my worn-out flannel shirts with thinly veiled disdain. But Derek was completely infatuated with her. Or perhaps he was infatuated with the doors her family name could open for him. When they got engaged, Derek came to me in a state of absolute panic. He sat at my worn kitchen table, ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, and told me that Valerie wanted to buy a home in Greenwich, Connecticut. He said that a $2.5 million estate was on the market, and if they did not secure it, Valerie would be humiliated in front of her high society friends. He admitted that despite his high salary, he did not have the liquid cash for the down payment and could not qualify for the massive mortgage on his own. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and begged for my help. He invoked his mother's memory, reminding me of the promise I made to her. Against every instinct in my body, I caved. I liquidated my entire retirement portfolio, the money Sarah and I had saved for 40 years, and I handed over $800,000 for the down payment. I co-signed the deed, making me a 50% legal owner, and I agreed to pay the $12,000 monthly mortgage out of my remaining business income while they got on their feet. I told myself I was securing my son's future. I told myself Sarah would be proud. On the morning of this wedding, I woke up at 4 o'clock. I carefully put on my best suit. It was off the rack, slightly outdated, and a little tight around the shoulders, but it was clean and pressed. I polished my only pair of dress shoes until they shined. I spent the entire 6-hour drive from Syracuse to Greenwich feeling a profound sense of pride. The autumn leaves were turning brilliant shades of orange and gold, and the crisp air felt like a blessing. I thought about how much Sarah would have loved this day. I imagined seeing my son waiting at the altar, stepping into his new life. I drove my reliable old Ford truck, the same truck that had hauled the tools that paid for his education and his mansion, and I smiled the entire way. When I arrived at this venue, a sprawling, exclusive country club, surrounded by towering oak trees and manicured lawns, I felt a slight flutter of nervousness. The parking lot was filled with luxury vehicles, shining black sedans and sleek sports cars. I pulled my truck into a spot near the back, not wanting to stick out too much. I took a deep breath, adjusted my tie, and walked toward the grand iron gates that led to the reception area. A security guard in a dark suit stood at a podium holding an electronic tablet. He smiled politely as I approached. I gave him my name, Thomas Gallagher, father of the groom. The guard tapped his screen, frowned slightly, and scrolled down. He tapped it again. His polite smile faded into a look of mild confusion. He asked me to spell my last name, which I did. He shook his head and said, "Sir, I am sorry, but your name is not on the guest list." I chuckled, assuming it was a simple clerical error. I told him there must be a mistake, that I was Derek's father. The guard looked at me, taking in my cheap suit and my weathered face, and his expression hardened just a fraction. He told me that there was no mistake on his end, that the list was finalized that morning by the bride and groom, and that there was no Thomas Gallagher authorized to enter the premises. Furthermore, he noted that the father of the groom seat was not assigned to anyone on his seating chart. A cold, heavy sensation began to spread through my chest. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Derek's number. It rang once and went straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I sent a text message asking him to come to the front gate because security was holding me up. I stood there for 10 minutes, watching the screen of my phone, waiting for the little bubbles to appear, showing he was typing a reply. Nothing happened. I stepped away from the podium, feeling the eyes of the security guard burning into my back. I walked along the perimeter of the venue, following a tall, manicured hedge until I reached a section where the trees parted. Through the clear, I had a clear view of the grand ballroom. The walls were made entirely of glass, illuminating the opulent celebration inside. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over the room. The tables were adorned with massive floral arrangements, and a live orchestra was playing on a raised stage. I moved closer, standing in the shadows of the trees, and peered through the glass. My breath caught in my throat. There was Derek, looking incredibly handsome, in a tailored tuxedo, standing in the center of the dance floor. He was holding Valerie close, laughing at something she said. They looked like a picture-perfect couple from a magazine. Surrounding them, cheering and clapping, were Winston and Patricia Kensington, along with dozens of their wealthy friends. I scanned the room, looking for my table. I looked at the head table where the parents were supposed to sit. Winston and Patricia were seated right next to the bride and groom. Next to Derek, where his father should have been, sat an uncle of Valerie's. There was no empty chair. There was no missing place setting. The room was perfectly full. The realization hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer to the ribs. There was no clerical error. There was no mistake by the wedding planner. I had not been forgotten. I had been deliberately erased. They did not want me there. Derek had looked at his life, looked at his new high society in-laws, and decided that his blue-collar, rough around the edges father was an embarrassment. He decided that the man who broke his back to give him everything, the man who was currently paying $12,000 a month to keep a roof over his head, was not worthy of standing beside him in front of his wealthy new friends. The shame and the heartbreak were so profound that for a moment my knees buckled. I reached out and grabbed the rough bark of an oak tree to steady myself. I stood in the darkness, a ghost looking into a world I had funded, but was not allowed to enter. I watched them toast. I watched them drink champagne. I watched my son smile a smile that I now realized was completely devoid of the boy I had raised. He had sold his soul for status, and he had thrown me away to secure it. I did not march to the front door. I did not scream at the security guard or demand to see my son. I did not want to give them the satisfaction of calling me a crazy, disruptive old man. The deep, agonizing grief inside me suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. The heartbroken father died in the shadows of those trees, and the hardened, methodical contractor took his place. In construction, when you realize the foundation of a building is rotten, you do not try to paint over it. You tear it down to the studs. I turned my back on the ballroom, walked quietly to my truck, and unlocked the door. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away from the country club without making a sound. The 6-hour drive back to Syracuse was the longest journey of my life. The golden autumn leaves that had looked so beautiful that morning now just looked dead and ready to fall. The radio remained off. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent working overtime, missing holidays and weekends, just to put extra money in Derek's college fund. I thought about the day I signed over my retirement savings, the moment of hesitation I felt before putting my pen to the paper, and how Derek had hugged me and told me I was the greatest father in the world. It was all a transaction to him. I was not a father. I was an ATM, a disposable resource to be drained and discarded when it no longer suited his aesthetic. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale gray light over my modest neighborhood. I did not change out of my suit. I walked straight into my kitchen, brewed a pot of black coffee, and sat at the same worn wooden table where Derek had begged me for the money. I opened my laptop and logged into my banking portal. The screen glowed brightly in the dim kitchen. I navigated to the recurring payments section. There it was, sitting at the top of the list. $12,000 scheduled to be wired to the Greenwich property mortgage account on the first of every month. I stared at the number for a long moment, thinking about the sheer volume of sweat and labor it took to generate that kind of cash. I moved my mouse over the delete button. I did not hesitate. I clicked it. A prompt appeared on the screen asking me to confirm the cancellation of the recurring transfer. I clicked confirm. The line of text vanished from the screen. I closed the laptop, took a slow sip of my bitter coffee, and looked out the kitchen window. The trap was set. The foundation was officially pulled out from under them. I knew they would not notice immediately. They would be busy enjoying their lavish honeymoon, posting pictures, and living their fantasy life. But the first of the month would eventually arrive. The bank would come knocking, and the fragile house of cards Derek had built would begin to sway in the wind. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to cry. I just needed to wait for the exact moment reality caught up with his arrogance. For 30 consecutive days, my telephone remained entirely silent. A whole month passed since the evening I stood in the shadows of that Greenwich country club and watched my only son celebrate the most important day of his life without me. I spent those weeks waking up early, brewing my coffee, and sitting at the table. The autumn leaves that lined the highway down to Connecticut withered, turned brown, and dropped to the frozen Syracuse ground. Winter settled in, bringing a bitter chill that seeped through the windows of my home. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the absolute freezing reality settling inside my chest. Every time I looked at the glowing screen of my cellular device, I felt a familiar sting. I knew exactly what a decent son would do. A son who genuinely cared about his father, a son who had simply made an honest mistake with a seating chart, would have called the very next morning. He would have been frantic. He would have left desperate voicemails, apologizing profusely, demanding to know why I had missed the ceremony. But Derek did not call. He did not send a text message. He did not send an email. The silence was not just an absence of sound. It was a loud, deliberate confirmation of his betrayal. It proved that he knew exactly why I was not at his wedding, and he was perfectly content with my absence. He was happily enjoying his lavish honeymoon, basking in the glow of his wealthy new in-laws, completely unbothered by the fact that the man who had funded his entire lifestyle had been left standing in the dark. I used the silence to fortify my resolve. I did not shed any more tears. I simply waited for the inevitable collision between his arrogance and his financial reality. I knew that the bank would not share his sense of entitlement. The collision happened exactly on the 30th day. It was a Tuesday morning. I was in the garage organizing my old construction tools, running a rag over the heavy iron wrenches that had paid for his Ivy League education. The harsh metallic scent of oil and cold steel filled the air. I heard a sharp, abrupt ping come from the pocket of my denim jeans. I pulled out my cell phone and looked at the notification on the screen. It was a text message from Derek. My heart beat a little faster, a reflexive, foolish parental reaction that I quickly suppressed. For a brief, irrational second, a tiny part of my brain wondered if it was an apology. Perhaps the guilt had finally caught up with him. Perhaps he had returned from his tropical honeymoon, looked at his wedding photos, and felt a pang of sorrow that his father was missing from every single frame. I unlocked the phone and opened the message. The words on the screen were a masterpiece of sheer, unadulterated audacity. The text read, "Dad, the mortgage payment did not clear. The bank just sent a final notice. Please fix this as soon as possible." I read the message 3 times. I read it slowly, letting the incredible disrespect wash over me. There was no greeting. There was no polite inquiry about my health. There was absolutely no mention of the wedding, the guest list, or the fact that we had not spoken in an entire month. He treated me with less courtesy than a dissatisfied customer speaking to a customer service representative. To Derek. I was not a father who had been deeply wounded. I was a malfunctioning piece of machinery. I was an automated bank account failing to process his withdrawal, and he was simply submitting a maintenance request. The pure transaction nature of his message extinguished any lingering trace of paternal softness I had left. He did not care if I was dead or alive, as long as the transfer cleared on the 1st of the month. I stared at the glowing letters on my screen, feeling a profound calm wash over me. I walked out of the cold garage and stepped into the pale morning sunlight. I took a deep breath of the freezing Syracuse air, letting it fill my lungs. I tapped the phone icon on my screen and selected Derek's contact name. I brought the device to my ear and listened to the steady, rhythmic tone of the outgoing call. I fully expected it to go to voicemail, just as it had on the night of his wedding reception. I assumed he was too busy networking with his new high society connections to actually speak to the blue-collar contractor. He kept hidden in the shadows. But this time was different. This time money was involved. The phone barely completed a single ring before the line clicked open. Derek answered the call instantly. His voice came through the speaker, crisp, sharp, and dripping with thinly veiled irritation. "Dad," he said, skipping any form of standard greeting. "Did you get my text message? You need to call your bank right now. The routing number must be messed up again because the portal is showing a past due balance. They are threatening to apply a late penalty fee to the account." He sounded inconvenienced, completely put out by the fact that he had to take time out of his busy morning to manage his father's supposed incompetence. There was no trace of guilt in his tone. There was no hesitation. He spoke with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who firmly believed he was entitled to the fruits of my lifelong labor. I stood perfectly still in my driveway, gripping the phone. I let his words hang in the empty air for a long moment. I listened to his shallow breathing on the other end of the line. "Derek." I said, my voice steady low and completely devoid of the warm affection I had always reserved for him. It has been a very long month. There was a brief pause on the line, a tiny fraction of a second where a normal human being might have registered the emotional weight of my statement. But Derek was too panicked about his luxury estate to care. I know, he replied, his tone dismissive and rushed. We have been incredibly busy with the honeymoon and getting Valerie settled into the new routine. I will tell you all about the trip later, but right now we really need to sort out this mortgage issue. Valerie is completely stressing out over this bank notice, and you know how bad her anxiety gets when things are not perfectly organized. I was trying to manage me. He was tossing out breadcrumbs of future conversation to keep me compliant, weaponizing his new wife's fabricated anxiety to force my hand. He assumed I was still the same blindly devoted man who had signed away his retirement fund just to see him smile. He assumed a quick promise of a future phone call would be enough to make me rush to the bank and restore his $12,000 monthly allowance. He truly believed he had me completely under his control. I did not immediately respond to his frantic demand regarding the bank. I let the silence stretch for a few more seconds, allowing the tension on his end of the line to build. When I finally spoke, my voice was perfectly calm, masking the storm of betrayal raging inside my chest. How was the wedding, Derek? I asked simply. I drove all the way down to Connecticut, but the security guard at the front gate told me my name was not on the guest list. I even walked around to the back and saw you dancing. It looked like a beautiful reception. The silence that followed my statement was profound. For a brief moment, the arrogant, demanding finance executive completely vanished. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head as he scrambled to process the fact that I had actually been there, that I had seen the crowded ballroom, and that his carefully constructed plan to keep me away had a major flaw. I had shown up. When he finally found his voice, it was pitched an octave higher, laced with a manufactured, breathless panic. Dad, he exclaimed, adopting a tone of utter devastation. I cannot believe you were actually there. You have no idea what a nightmare that day turned into. The wedding planner completely ruined the master guest list. She uploaded an older draft into the security system and the catering software. It was an absolute disaster. I was talking incredibly fast, now weaving a complex web of lies with the practiced ease of a corporate salesman. We looked everywhere for you. He continued, his voice dripping with fake emotion. When you were not in your seat for the ceremony, I panicked. I sent 2 of my groomsmen out to the parking lot to search for your truck. Valerie was absolutely heartbroken. She was sitting in the bridal suite crying her eyes out, thinking that you had gotten into a terrible car accident on the highway. We were so worried about you, and to think you were just turned away by some incompetent security guard. I am going to sue that event company for ruining our special day. It was a spectacular performance. If I had not stood in the shadows of the oak trees and watched them laughing, drinking champagne and dancing without a care in the world, I might have actually believed him. I might have felt guilty for turning around and going home. But I had seen the truth with my own 2 eyes. There was no missing chair. There was no frantic search. There were no tears in the bridal suite. It was a perfectly executed, flawless lie. I did not challenge his story. I did not tell him that I saw Valerie's uncle sitting in my designated seat. I simply offered a mild, non-committal hum of understanding. Well, I said quietly, that is very unfortunate. I drove back home so as not to cause a disruption. Derek seized upon my apparent acceptance of his lie instantly. He did not linger on the apology. He did not ask how my drive home was. He immediately pivoted right back to his primary concern, the money. It was terrible, he said, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. But we cannot change the past. Right now, we are dealing with a massive crisis, Dad. This bank notice about the mortgage payment is pushing us over the edge. He lowered his voice, trying to sound intimate and vulnerable. The wedding went way over budget, he confessed. The vendors overcharged us for everything, and we are completely tapped out. We barely have any liquid cash left in our checking accounts. On top of that, Valerie has been dealing with severe health anxiety. The stress of the wedding planner ruining the guest list, combined with this terrifying letter from the bank, is making her physically ill. She has barely slept in 3 days. We are terrified of losing the house. I listened to him paint this pathetic picture of financial ruin and fragile health. It was incredibly difficult to remain silent. I knew exactly what he was doing. I was building a narrative where they were helpless victims of circumstance, completely dependent on my financial rescue. He wanted me to feel responsible for his new wife's fabricated medical anxiety. He wanted me to feel an urgent, desperate need to protect them from the harsh realities of the world. When I still did not offer an immediate solution, Derek deployed his ultimate weapon. It was a tactic so deeply manipulative and cruel that it made my blood run absolutely cold. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. "I really need you right now. You promised Mom before she died that you would help us secure this house. You held her hand and told her you would make sure I had a solid foundation. If we lose this property because of a missed payment, it would break her heart. Please do not let Mom down. We just need you to fix whatever glitch is happening with your bank account so the $12,000 can clear." He weaponized the memory of his dead mother to secure a mortgage payment on a luxury estate he had deliberately banned me from entering. He used the sacred promise I made to a dying woman as a tool to extort me. The sheer breathtaking sociopathy of his words echoed in the silence of my kitchen. The last remaining fragment of the loving father I used to be evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only the cold, calculating contractor. I did not raise my voice. I did not curse at him. I maintained perfect, terrifying control over my emotions. I took a deep breath, looking at the faded photographs of Sarah that still hung on my refrigerator door. "I understand, Derek," I said smoothly. My tone was flat, offering no warmth, but also betraying no anger. "I will look into the bank issue on my end and see what can be done about the account." "Oh, thank God." Derek breathed, his relief palpable and immediate. "Thank you so much, Dad. I knew you would fix it. Just let me know as soon as the transfer goes through so I can calm Valerie down." "I will handle it," I replied. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. I did not say goodbye. I placed the device face down on the wooden kitchen table. The silence in the room was absolute. I had not promised to pay the mortgage. I had only promised to look into the issue, and that was exactly what I was going to do. I sat in the quiet kitchen for another hour, watching the morning light slowly fill the room. The coffee in my mug grew completely cold, but I did not bother to pour a fresh cup. My mind was already racing ahead, organizing the facts and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. I needed absolute proof of their incredible deception before I made my very next move. The time for blind, foolish, pathetic trust was permanently over. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that phone call ended, running my calloused thumb over the smooth, worn surface of the wood. The quiet of my house wrapped around me, but my mind was a loud, chaotic storm of analytical thought. I spent 40 years working in the unforgiving commercial construction business. You do not survive 4 decades in that industry without developing a highly attuned intuition for when a subcontractor or a supplier is lying directly to your face. You learn to listen carefully to what is not being said, and you learn how to spot the invisible structural flaws in a story long before the roof actually caves in. Derek had built a very detailed, emotionally charged narrative over the phone, but the foundation of his entire story was incredibly brittle. He claimed that an incompetent wedding planner had ruined the master guest list. He claimed that my unexpected absence was a devastating shock to both of them. He claimed that Valerie, his beautiful new bride, had spent the happiest day of her life, locked inside a luxurious bridal suite, sobbing uncontrollably because she firmly believed I had died in a horrible car crash on the interstate. I played those frantic words over and over in my head, picking apart the logic. If they had truly believed I was lying dead in a ditch somewhere, why did neither of them bother to call the highway patrol? Why did they not call the local hospitals in Connecticut or New York to search for me? And most importantly, why did a full 30 days pass without a single phone call, text message, or email to check on my well-being? If my new daughter-in-law had been physically ill with worry, why did it take an overdue bank notice to finally prompt a rushed communication from my son? The mathematics of human empathy simply did not add up. The timeline of their alleged suffering was entirely fraudulent. I needed visual evidence to confirm what my gut was already screaming at me. I needed to see exactly how this alleged financial ruin and severe health anxiety were manifesting in their daily lives. The problem was, I am a 71-year-old man whose technological expertise extends only to sending brief emails and checking online bank statements. I do not understand the mechanics of social media. I do not have an account on any of those platforms where people broadcast their private lives to the general public. But I knew exactly who did. I stood up from my chair, grabbed my thick winter jacket, and walked out my front door. I crossed the small patch of frosted lawn separating my property from the house next door. My neighbors, a kind middle-aged couple, had a teenage son named Leo. Leo was a smart, quiet kid, always walking around the neighborhood, with his face buried in a glowing smartphone. I knocked heavily on their front door. Leo answered a few moments later, holding a half-eaten apple and looking mildly surprised to see me standing on his porch. I offered him a friendly smile and asked if he had a few spare minutes to help an old man figure out how to use the internet. He shrugged, stepped out into the chilly air, and politely asked what I needed. I told him I was trying to find some recent wedding pictures of my daughter-in-law, but I did not know how to navigate the applications. I gave him Valerie's full name and asked if he could look her up on that popular photo-sharing platform. Leo pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumbs moving rapidly across the glass screen with a speed that made me slightly dizzy. Within 10 seconds, he nodded his head. He told me he found her specifics profile and that her account was completely public, meaning anyone in the world could view her pictures without needing special permission or a friend request. He handed the device over to me, instructing me to simply swipe my finger up to scroll through the images. I held the small illuminated rectangle carefully in my rough hands. What I saw vividly displayed on that high-resolution screen instantly dismantled every single lie my son had just fed me. There was no devastating financial ruin. There was no crippling, sleep-depriving health anxiety. The screen was a vibrant, endless collage of pure, unadulterated luxury and shameless extravagance. I slowly scrolled down with my thumb, tracing the digital breadcrumbs of their lives over the exact 30 days they supposedly spent mourning my absence. The very first photograph was posted the morning immediately following the wedding ceremony. Valerie was wearing a customized silk robe holding a crystal flute filled with expensive champagne, standing on the sunlit balcony of what looked like a massive presidential hotel suite. The caption beneath the photo proudly declared it the most perfect, flawless wedding a girl could ever possibly dream of. There was absolutely no mention of a ruined guest list. There was no hint of a terrified, sobbing bride. There was just pure, triumphant vanity radiating from her smile. I took a slow breath and continued to scroll down the page. The next extensive series of photographs meticulously documented their honeymoon. They had not taken a modest, budget-conscious trip to save money for their mortgage. They had flown first class across the world to the Maldives. There were dozens of high-quality pictures showcasing an extravagant overwater bungalow, hovering above crystal-clear turquoise water. I know exactly what those exclusive island resorts cost. You do not stay in a private villa like that for less than $3,000 or $4,000 a single night. I saw pictures of Valerie posing on pristine white sand beaches, proudly displaying brand new designer handbags, diamond jewelry, and expensive sunglasses. I saw short videos of Derek, the same son, who just claimed to be completely tapped out and on the terrifying verge of losing his home, laughing loudly as he ordered imported caviar and $100 cocktails at exclusive oceanfront restaurants. Every single post insulted the immense sacrifices I had made. I saw another picture posted just 2 days ago. Valerie was sitting at a high-end Manhattan bistro, looking perfectly healthy, radiant, and completely relaxed. The caption boasted about her amazing luxury shopping spree and how incredibly lucky she was to have a husband who spoiled her so completely. I stared at her smiling face for a long minute. This was the fragile woman Derek explicitly claimed was currently suffering from severe health anxiety. This was the desperate couple hovering on the brink of losing everything, who had just begged a grieving widower to honor his dead wife's memory by paying their bills. I handed the smartphone back to Leo. I thanked him for his valuable help and walked slowly back to my empty house. The deep anger inside my chest had burned away all the lingering sadness, leaving behind a state of absolute, crystalline mental clarity. My instincts had been absolutely correct. I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, the silence pressing heavily against my shoulders. The images I had just seen on that small smartphone screen burned brightly in my mind. The crystal champagne flutes, the private oceanfront villas, the designer shopping bags in Manhattan. It was a sickening display of greed masquerading as financial distress. But as angry as those photographs made me, they only told half the story. They showed me how Derek and Valerie were spending the money I bled to give them, but they did not explain the sheer depth of their cruelty. They did not explain why I was actively banned from walking through the gates of that country club. I needed to know exactly what narrative my son had spun to his new high society family to justify the complete absence of his only living parent. I opened my laptop again. My hands were steady now. The trembling had stopped. I typed Valerie's full name into the search engine, hoping to find a public registry or website holding more clues. Instead, the first result that populated was a link to a professional videography portfolio. It was titled with their first names and the wedding date. I clicked the link. A high-definition video player filled the center of my screen. The production value was staggering. It looked like a cinematic movie trailer. I pressed play. Gentle sweeping orchestral music filled my kitchen. The video began with slow-panning drone shots of the lavish Greenwich estate. I watched high-resolution footage of the floral arrangements. I had paid for the towering ice sculptures and perfectly arranged tables set with fine crystal. Then the camera shifted to the bridal suite. I saw Valerie surrounded by her bridesmaids, all wearing matching silk robes, laughing and sipping drinks. There was not a single tear in sight. There was no panic, no frantic search for a missing father. The narrative Derek fed me completely disintegrated before my eyes. The video transitioned to the ceremony. I watched my son stand at the altar looking confident. I watched Valerie walk down the aisle on the arm of her wealthy father, Winston Kensington. I watched them exchange vows, slide rings onto their fingers, and share their first kiss. Every frame was meticulously edited to showcase a flawless union of two successful people. But the devastating blow that would alter my life came near the end of the film. The footage shifted from the dance floor to the seated dinner. The ambient noise faded away, replaced by the clear sound of a microphone tapping. Winston Kensington stood at the head table. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and an aura of generational wealth. He held a glass of champagne in one hand and a microphone in the other. The camera zoomed in on his face as he addressed the crowded ballroom. He spoke eloquently about his daughter, praising her beauty and accomplishments. Then he turned his gaze toward my son. He smiled a warm, paternal smile that made my stomach churn. Winston spoke about how protective he was of his daughter, and how he had initially been skeptical of the young man she brought home. He said he wanted to make sure Derek was worthy of his little girl. And then Winston delivered a speech that effectively assassinated my character in front of 200 people. He raised his glass higher. He told the crowd how incredibly proud he was to welcome a young man of such extraordinary caliber into the Kensington family. He praised Derek for his relentless work ethic and his brilliant financial mind. He proudly announced to the entire room that Derek was a true self-made prodigy. He explicitly mentioned the $2.5 million estate in Connecticut. He applauded Derek for purchasing such a magnificent home all by himself at such a young age without relying on a single penny of outside help or family money. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenched so tightly, my teeth ached. My son sat there, nodding humbly accepting the applause of the crowd for a massive financial achievement he did not earn. But the praise for his fake financial independence was not the worst part. The killing blow came seconds later. Winston's expression grew deeply serious. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of solemn, profound respect. He looked directly at Derek and said, "We are so incredibly proud of you for overcoming your dark past. To build this magnificent life for yourself after surviving a violently alcoholic deadbeat father who abandoned you is nothing short of miraculous. You broke the cycle of abuse, Derek. You rose above the trauma, and you proved that a man is defined by his own ambition, not by the sins of a worthless father. We are honored to be the real family you never had." The ballroom erupted into thunderous, sustained applause. The camera panned to Derek. My son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of love and resources I possessed, lowered his head and wiped a fake tear from his eye. Valerie leaned over and kissed his cheek, playing the role of the supportive, comforting wife. I hit the pause button on the laptop. The image froze on Derek's face. The silence in my kitchen returned, but it felt entirely different now. It was the silence of a grave. I had been sober my entire life. I had never taken a single drink of alcohol because my own grandfather had struggled with it, and I swore I would never bring that chaos into my home. I had never raised a hand to Sarah, and I had never laid a finger on Derek. I had broken my back, ruined my knees, and sacrificed 40 years of my life to ensure he had a warm bed, a full stomach, and a world-class education. I had literally drained my life savings to buy the very house Winston Kensington was currently praising him for purchasing. And in return, my son had fabricated a horrific defamatory lie to win the sympathy and the profound respect of the Manhattan elite. This was not just a case of simple snobbery. This was not just a son being mildly embarrassed by his blue-collar dad. This was a calculated, malicious character assassination. Derek had realized that if I attended the wedding, his entire carefully constructed facade would instantly collapse. If Winston met me, he would realize I was not a violent drunk. If Winston spoke to me, he might discover the truth about the Connecticut estate. Derek did not ban me from the venue because my suit was outdated. He banned me because my very existence threatened to expose him as a massive fraud. He needed me to be a monster so he could play the triumphant victim. I sat still, letting the cold reality wash over me completely. The grieving father was gone. The boy I raised had vanished, replaced by a ruthless, calculating stranger who wanted my money, but wished I was dead. I slowly closed the laptop. I was going to show him exactly what losing his father really meant. I picked up my cell phone from the kitchen counter. The screen was still warm from the video I had just watched. I opened my message thread with Derek. I needed to buy myself time to execute my next move without raising his suspicions. I typed out a brief, sterile response. I told him that my bank was currently reviewing my accounts due to a flagged security issue and that he needed to give me a few days to sort it out. I hit send. I knew that mentioning a bank security issue would keep him pacified. He would assume it was just a bureaucratic delay, not a deliberate severing of his financial lifeline. I watched the delivery confirmation appear on the screen, then I powered the device off completely. I walked into my home office, a small room lined with filing cabinets containing decades of construction invoices and tax returns. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my heavy metal desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. It contained the original closing documents for the Greenwich estate. I opened the folder and spread the heavy watermarked pages across my desk. There was the bank transfer receipt clearly displaying the $800,000 that had moved directly from my retirement account to the escrow agency. There was the master deed explicitly listing Thomas Gallagher and Derek Gallagher as 50% joint tenants with rights of survivorship. I had insisted on that specific legal structure when we bought the house. It was not because I distrusted my son at the time, but because 40 years in the contracting business had taught me to always protect a massive capital investment. Sarah had agreed with me. We wanted to ensure that if anything catastrophic ever happened to Derek, the property would remain secure within our family, safe from creditors or bad investments. I traced my finger over my signature on the bottom of the page. It was a firm, heavy script. That signature represented a lifetime of broken fingernails, aching joints, and delayed dreams. I gathered the papers, placed them carefully back into the manila folder, and grabbed my winter coat. I drove straight into downtown Syracuse. The morning traffic was heavy, but my mind was completely focused. I pulled into the underground parking garage of a sleek glass high-rise and took the elevator to the 32nd floor. I was going to see Jonathan Mitchell. Jonathan was not a gentle hand-holding family attorney. He was a ruthless, highly expensive corporate litigator who specialized in breaking hostile takeovers and dismantling fraudulent partnerships. I had met him 20 years ago when a massive commercial developer tried to stiff my construction crew out of a $500,000 payment. Jonathan had tied their legal team up in so many knots that they ended up paying me double just to make him go away. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and right now I needed a shark. I walked into his reception area, bypassed the waiting room chairs, and asked his secretary to interrupt whatever meeting he was currently in. I told her it was a personal emergency for Tom Gallagher and that I would not leave until I saw him. Less than 2 minutes later, Jonathan walked out of his corner office. He was a tall man in his late 60s with sharp eyes and silver hair. He took one look at my face, dismissed his secretary, and ushered me inside. He closed the heavy oak door, cutting off all the noise from the busy firm. I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk and slid the manila folder across the polished wood. I did not waste time with pleasantries or emotional outbursts. I told him plainly that my son had committed a profound betrayal, that he was trying to extort me to pay a $12,000 monthly mortgage on a property he had actively banned me from visiting. I wanted to legally compel Derek to either buy out my half for the current market value or force the property onto the open market so I could reclaim my original $800,000 investment. The thought of Derek standing in that ballroom, basking in the glow of his father-in-law's praise, while secretly relying on my bank account to survive, made me sick to my stomach. I wanted the lawsuit delivered directly to Derek's office in the middle of his workday, served by a man in a cheap suit, so everyone in his elite finance firm would see it happen. I was prepared to liquidate everything and salt the earth. Jonathan listened to my explanation in silence. He did not offer any empty condolences or fake sympathy. He simply nodded his head, put on his wire-rimmed reading glasses, and opened the folder. He reviewed my original closing documents, verifying the joint tenancy agreement and the proof of the down payment. He confirmed that my legal standing was absolutely rock solid. I had the absolute legal right to force a sale at any time. He turned to his computer monitor and logged into his firm's premium access database for property and title records. He told me he was going to pull the most recent filings from the county clerk in Connecticut, just to ensure no new tax liens or municipal assessments had been placed on the house since the original purchase. I sat back in my chair, feeling a dark sense of satisfaction settling in my chest. I was finally taking control of the situation. I watched Jonathan's fingers move rapidly across his keyboard. I listened to the quiet, rhythmic clicking of the keys, waiting for him to confirm that everything was clear to proceed with the lawsuit against my son. Suddenly, the clicking stopped. Jonathan leaned closer to his monitor. His posture went completely rigid. I watched as the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and put them back on, staring at the bright screen as if it had just shown him a ghost. He scrolled down the page, his breathing growing shallow and irregular. He reached for his desk phone and pressed a button, telling his assistant to immediately halt all his calls for the next hour. He slowly turned his monitor around so it faced me directly. He looked at me with an expression of profound, unfiltered shock. He asked me when I had last authorized a major financial encumbrance against the property. I looked at him in total confusion. I told him I had never authorized any such thing. I told him the only encumbrance was the primary mortgage that we had established on the day of the original purchase. Jonathan shook his head slowly. The silence in the room became incredibly heavy, suffocating me. He pointed a trembling finger at a digital document displayed on his screen. He told me I needed to brace myself for what he was about to show me. He said the betrayal I had experienced at the wedding was nothing compared to the financial crimes staring back at us. I leaned forward, gripping the armrests tightly. The silence in Jonathan's office was deafening. I looked at the bright computer monitor he had turned to face me. The screen was filled with complicated legal text stamped with the official seal of the Fairfield County Clerk in Connecticut. I asked him to explain it to me in plain English. Jonathan took a deep breath, steepled his fingers together, and looked at me with a grave expression. He pointed to the top of the digital document. It was a home equity line of credit, commonly known as a HELOC. Jonathan explained that exactly 3 months ago, a massive loan had been taken out against the Greenwich estate. The amount was a staggering $500,000. I shook my head immediately. I told Jonathan that was impossible. I reminded him that I was the co-owner of the property and that no financial institution would ever approve a loan of that magnitude against the equity of the house without my direct, explicit authorization. I told him I had never received a phone call from the bank. I had never answered an email regarding a loan application, and I certainly had never signed a single piece of paper approving a $500,000 line of credit. Jonathan did not argue with me. He simply pressed a button on his keyboard, and a moment later, the laser printer in the corner of his office hummed to life. We sat in silence as the machine spit out paper. Jonathan retrieved the printed documents and walked back to his desk. He placed the final page directly in front of me. He handed me a silver pen and told me to use it as a pointer. He asked me to look at the bottom right corner of the page right next to the notary stamp. I lowered my gaze to the paper. There, sitting starkly on the designated borrower signature line, was my name. I stared at the ink. The blood rushed in my ears, creating a low sound that drowned out the ambient noise of the city outside the window. The signature was expertly executed. It had the same heavy, deliberate loops that I used. It had the same sharp angle on the capital letters. If a loan officer had glanced at it quickly, they would have easily accepted it as genuine. But I knew my own handwriting. I had spent 40 years signing thousands of construction permits and supply manifests. I knew the microscopic nuances of how my pen struck the paper. The signature on the document was incredibly close, but it lacked the natural flowing pressure of a human hand. It was perfectly uniform, completely devoid of the slight variations that occur when a person actually writes their name. It was an immaculate, high-resolution digital forgery. Derek had stolen my signature. He had likely taken the digital scan from our original closing documents on the house, isolated the image of my handwriting, and superimposed it onto this fraudulent loan application. He had carefully orchestrated a massive financial transaction behind my back. He had siphoned $500,000 of equity out of the property that I had drained my retirement to secure. The breathtaking audacity of the crime left me speechless. I had walked into this office feeling like a heartbroken father who had been callously excluded from a family celebration. Now I was looking at undeniable proof that my only son was a dangerous, calculating criminal who had deliberately stolen my identity to enrich himself. I looked up at Jonathan. My voice was surprisingly steady when I finally spoke. I asked him what this meant from a legal standpoint. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes focused entirely on me. He told me that this fundamentally altered the entire landscape of our situation. He explained that we were no longer dealing with a simple family dispute over real estate. We had crossed a massive, irreversible threshold into the realm of severe criminal law. Jonathan broke down the specific charges. He explained that by submitting a forged document to a federally insured financial institution to secure a $500,000 loan, Derek had committed first-degree bank fraud. Furthermore, because the funds were undoubtedly processed electronically across state lines, he was also looking at federal wire fraud. Jonathan did not sugarcoat the severity of the consequences. He told me that the federal government does not take bank fraud lightly. These were severe felony charges that carried mandatory minimum prison sentences. If the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Banking Commission were alerted to this forgery, Derek would not just lose his high-paying finance job, he would lose his freedom. He would be facing years in a federal penitentiary. The young, arrogant executive who had stood in that glittering ballroom, soaking up the applause of the Manhattan elite, was essentially a dead man walking. He had built his entire glamorous lifestyle on a foundation of brazen, easily provable felonies. I sat in the leather chair, letting the immense gravity of Jonathan's words settle over me. For the past month, I had been grappling with the agonizing question of why my son had abandoned me. I had wondered if my blue-collar manners were truly that repulsive to him. Now the full horrifying picture was becoming crystal clear. Derek did not just keep me away from the wedding because he was a snob. He kept me away because my presence was a massive liability to his criminal enterprise. If I had attended that wedding, I might have casually mentioned the house to his new father-in-law. I might have said something that would have unraveled his entire web of lies. He needed me completely isolated and removed from the equation so he could use my name and my credit history as his personal piggy bank. The profound sickness in my stomach slowly evaporated, replaced by a chilling, absolute clarity. Derek had assumed I was too old, too technologically illiterate, and too blindly devoted to ever check the property records. He had assumed I would simply keep paying the $12,000 monthly mortgage without ever asking a single question. He had severely underestimated the man who raised him. I looked at the forged signature on the paper. I felt no lingering affection for the person who had executed this crime. The son I had worked my entire life to protect was completely gone. In his place stood a parasite actively trying to drain the last drops of my life savings. I pushed the paper back across the desk toward Jonathan. I looked my ruthless corporate lawyer directly in the eyes. I asked what our immediate next steps should be. Jonathan smiled a cold, predatory expression that told me he was exactly the right man for this job. He told me that we needed to follow the money before we dropped the hammer. I left Jonathan's office feeling a strange mixture of profound exhaustion and intense burning adrenaline. I drove back to my empty house in Syracuse and walked straight into the kitchen. I did not unpack my briefcase. I did not sit down to rest. I grabbed a heavy canvas duffel bag from the hall closet and began to pack. I threw in 2 thick wool blankets, a heavy winter coat, and a pair of insulated work boots. I filled a large steel thermos with black coffee and packed a small cooler with bottled water and turkey sandwiches. If I was going to follow the money, I needed to start at the physical location where all of this deception was rooted. I needed to see the $2.5 million property with my own eyes. I needed to know exactly what Derek was doing behind the closed doors of the estate I had sacrificed my entire life to purchase. I loaded my supplies into the passenger seat of my rusted Ford truck, turned the ignition, and began the 6-hour drive back down to Connecticut. I arrived in Greenwich just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns. I did not drive up to the massive wrought iron gates of the estate. I knew better than to announce my presence. Instead, I parked my truck 200 yards down the winding tree-lined street. I found a discreet spot, tucked beneath the heavy drooping branches of a massive weeping willow. From this specific vantage point, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the main entrance and the wide circular driveway. But my weathered vehicle remained completely hidden in the deep shadows of the evening. I turned off the engine, cracked the window just enough to let in fresh air, and wrapped one of the thick wool blankets around my shoulders. I settled into the driver's seat, resting my calloused hands on the steering wheel. I prepared myself for a long, uncomfortable night. I expected to see Derek's sleek luxury sedan eventually pull into the driveway. I expected the warm glow of lights turning on in the master bedroom. But as the hours slowly ticked by, the house remained completely dark. It sat there like a massive empty monument. Midnight passed, then 2 in the morning, and finally, the pale light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. I drank lukewarm coffee from my steel thermos and chewed on a dry sandwich, keeping my eyes firmly fixed on the property. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, a vehicle finally approached the gates. My heart beat a little faster, but it was not Derek. It was a large black luxury sport utility vehicle with tinted windows. The gates swung open, and the vehicle pulled into the circular driveway. The doors opened, and a group of 5 people stepped out. They were all young, dressed in brightly colored vacation clothes, holding expensive digital cameras, and laughing loudly. The driver popped the trunk and began unloading an enormous amount of luggage, pulling out rolling suitcases, garment bags, and large cases of alcohol. I watched in total confusion as one of the young men walked up to the front door, punched a code into the electronic keypad, and ushered the entire group inside. Less than an hour later, a commercial catering van pulled up to the house. 2 workers carried large aluminum trays of food and boxes of glassware through the front door. Loud, heavy bass music began to thump from the backyard patio, echoing down the quiet, affluent street. I sat in my truck, gripping the steering wheel. This was not my son coming home. This looked like a wild, extravagant weekend party being hosted by complete strangers. I remained parked under that weeping willow for the entire day and straight through a second freezing night. I barely slept. The loud music from the estate continued well past 2 in the morning. The next day, the pattern repeated itself in a slightly different configuration. The group of young people packed their bags, loaded them back into a black transport vehicle, and departed. 2 hours later, a professional cleaning crew arrived in a small white van. 4 women with buckets of supplies spent 3 hours scrubbing the house from top to bottom. As soon as the cleaning crew drove away, a new set of vehicles arrived. This time it was a convoy of 3 expensive cars. A large family stepped out carrying baby strollers, massive suitcases, and bags of groceries. They punched a code into the front door and moved in, treating the $2.5 million estate like a high-end resort. I watched a man carry a small child on his shoulders while pointing at the beautifully landscaped gardens I was actively paying the mortgage for. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped together in my mind with devastating clarity. Derek and Valerie were not living in this house. They had absolutely no intention of ever living in this house. They had taken the pristine, luxurious property that I had bankrupted myself to secure, and they had turned it into a commercial commodity. The massive home was nothing more than a profitable playground for wealthy tourists. I sat in the freezing cab of my truck watching this new family carry expensive groceries through the grand mahogany front doors. The crisp Connecticut wind battered the sides of my vehicle, but the chill that settled deeply into my bones had absolutely nothing to do with the harsh autumn weather. I thought back to the agonizing phone call I had endured with Derek just a few days prior. I remembered the perfectly pitched panic in his voice as he begged me to cover the $12,000 mortgage payment. I remembered how he claimed Valerie was physically ill with anxiety, terrified that the bank would foreclose on the sacred home they were desperately trying to build together. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. They were not losing sleep over the possibility of losing their marital home. They were irritated because my canceled transfer was eating into their massive profit margins. They were treating my life savings as free capital for a highly lucrative hospitality business. My mind immediately drifted back to the forged document, sitting securely on Jonathan's desk back in Syracuse. The $500,000 line of credit that Derek had illegally siphoned from the equity of this exact property. If they were not using this massive estate as their primary residence, and they were generating tens of thousands of dollars a month by renting it out to wealthy vacationers, then where exactly did that stolen $500,000 go? It clearly was not used for structural renovations or luxury landscaping. In the commercial construction industry, when funds inexplicably vanish from a project site without any visible improvements to the physical building, you know immediately that the money is being funneled into a completely separate, hidden enterprise. Derek was operating a sophisticated shadow economy. He had effectively transformed me into an unwitting, unpaid investor in his fraudulent empire. I turned the ignition key and pulled my truck away from the curb, leaving the magnificent Greenwich estate in my rearview mirror. I drove slowly through the affluent streets until I reached the commercial district of the town. I needed a quiet place to sit down, connect to the internet, and conduct a thorough digital investigation. I spotted a small, brightly lit diner sitting on a corner lot. It was almost empty, save for a few locals drinking coffee. I parked my vehicle, grabbed my laptop bag, and walked inside. I slid into a booth in the back corner, ordered a black coffee from a tired waitress, and opened my computer. I connected to the public wireless network, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I knew exactly what I was looking for. I just needed to find the specific platform they were using to run their illicit business. I opened a search engine and began typing keywords associated with high-end vacation rentals in Fairfield County. I bypassed standard booking websites and specifically targeted exclusive platforms designed for luxury corporate retreats and private estates. I filtered the results by location, focusing strictly on the zip code of the property. I narrowed the parameters further, selecting homes with 5 bedrooms, a heated pool, and extensive private gardens. The engine processed my request and generated a list of available properties. I scrolled past a few modern waterfront homes before my eyes locked onto a familiar image. It was a high-resolution, professionally edited photograph of the exact house I had just spent 2 days watching. The pristine white columns, the immaculate landscaping, and the sweeping circular driveway were unmistakable. I clicked on the profile. My stomach tightened as the comprehensive listing loaded onto my screen. The property was obnoxiously titled The Kensington Manor, an arrogant nod to Valerie's maiden name. The description beneath the photographs was a masterpiece of pretentious marketing. It boasted about the property being a secluded, ultra-luxurious sanctuary, perfect for discerning guests and high-society gatherings. It highlighted the custom granite kitchen countertops I had personally paid a premium to install. It showcased the imported Italian marble in the master bathroom that I specifically approved when Derek begged for an upgrade. The listing offered a dedicated concierge service, private catering, and daily housekeeping. They were not casually renting out a spare room. They had built a fully operational, lucrative boutique hotel using my life savings as their capital investment. I moved my cursor over to the pricing and availability calendar. The numbers displayed on the screen were absolutely staggering. The base rate for a single night in the house was $2,500. During peak holiday weekends and the summer season, the price surged to over $3,000 a night. I clicked on the booking calendar to view their upcoming schedule. The entire month of November was almost completely blocked out. December was entirely booked. I did some quick mental math. If they were renting the estate for an average of 20 nights a month at the minimum base rate, they were grossing $50,000 every 30 days. Even after paying for cleaning crews, landscaping maintenance, and third-party booking fees, they were easily netting between $30,000 and $40,000 of pure profit every month. I sat in the quiet diner, the hot mug warming my calloused hands, and let the sheer magnitude of their deception wash over me. Less than a week ago, my son had called me in a state of manufactured panic. He had practically cried over the phone, claiming they were completely broke from the wedding expenses. He spun a pathetic tale about Valerie suffering from severe health anxiety because they were terrified the bank was going to foreclose on their dream home. He begged me, invoking the sacred memory of his dead mother, to rush to my bank and ensure his $12,000 monthly allowance was deposited into his account. All the while, he was actively generating tens of thousands of dollars in illicit income from the property he was begging me to save. He demanded that a retired contractor pay his base mortgage while he pocketed a massive corporate salary and ran a highly profitable shadow business. I scrolled down to the bottom of the web page to read the guest reviews. I needed to know exactly how long this fraudulent enterprise had been operational. The platform displayed dozens of glowing 5-star reviews. People praised the immaculate condition of the property and the highly responsive hosts, Derek and Valerie. I sorted the reviews by date, moving to the oldest entries on the list. The very first review was posted exactly 2 weeks after we had officially closed on the property. 2 weeks. They never intended to live in that house. From the moment Derek first sat at my kitchen table and begged for the down payment, the purchase had been a calculated business strategy. They targeted a luxury estate. They knew they could monetize, manipulating me into acting as their 0% interest financier. They needed my perfect credit score and my liquid retirement funds to secure the asset, immediately flipping it into a cash-generating machine. I closed the internet browser and leaned back against the booth. The waitress walked by and refilled my coffee mug, completely unaware of the financial conspiracy I had just unraveled on my screen. A new, far more troubling question began to form in my mind. If Derek and Valerie were aggressively monetizing the Connecticut estate, pulling in $40,000 a month in rental income on top of their regular corporate salaries, then why did Derek forge my signature to secure a $500,000 line of credit? Where did that massive sum of money go? He clearly did not need it to cover his daily living expenses, and he certainly did not inject it into the physical property, as the house remained exactly as it was when we bought it. Furthermore, if they were consistently renting out this property to wealthy tourists, where were they actually sleeping at night? They had to be living somewhere. They needed a primary residence that matched their obsession with high society status. I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket. I needed highly discreet assistance to track down their actual physical address and follow the missing $500,000. I scrolled through my contact list until I found the number for Richard Caldwell, a private investigator I hired a decade ago to run background checks on commercial suppliers. I pressed the call button and patiently waited. Richard answered with his typical gruff, no-nonsense tone. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I had an emergency family matter that required an immediate off-the-books investigation. I gave him Derek and Valerie's full names along with their respective places of employment. I told Richard I needed to know exactly where they laid their heads at night. I gave him 48 hours to deliver a comprehensive report. I hung up the phone, closed my laptop, and left a $20 bill on the diner table. The time for observation was officially over. It was time to build the trap. I left the diner and immediately dialed Jonathan's direct office line. He answered on the second ring, his tone sharp and ready for business. I told him what I had just discovered, detailing the luxury rental operation Derek and Valerie were running out of the Greenwich estate. I explained the staggering nightly rates and the fully booked calendar. Jonathan was silent for a moment before letting out a low, impressed whistle. He noted that they were generating massive commercial revenue on a property I was personally financing, effectively turning me into their unpaid, oblivious business partner. But I told him that was only a fraction of the overall problem. The rental income explained how they were funding their extravagant lifestyle and international honeymoons. But it did not explain the missing $500,000. If they were rolling in thousands of dollars of illicit cash every month, there was absolutely no logical reason for Derek to forge my signature on a home equity line of credit. The $500,000 had simply vanished into thin air, leaving no physical trace on the estate itself. I told Jonathan we needed to find out exactly where that massive sum of money had been funneled. Jonathan agreed completely. He told me that in cases of severe financial fraud, the paper trail always tells the undeniable truth, no matter how carefully the criminals attempt to hide their tracks. He said he was going to bring in a highly specialized forensic accountant. He kept on a strict retainer for corporate espionage cases. His name was Philip, and Jonathan promised that Philip could track a single dollar bill through a dozen shell companies and offshore accounts without breaking a sweat. I authorized the expense immediately. I did not care how much it cost to uncover the facts. I wanted every single financial transaction analyzed, categorized, and documented with absolute, irrefutable precision. I wanted a weapon so sharp and undeniable that Derek would not be able to formulate a single lie to defend himself. The wait was agonizing. For 3 days, I paced the floors of my modest Syracuse home, unable to focus on anything else. I kept my phone charged and in my pocket at all times. Finally, on Thursday afternoon, Jonathan called me. He did not sound triumphant. He sounded grim, carrying the heavy tone of a man who had just uncovered something deeply disturbing. He told me that Philip had successfully traced the entire path of the $500,000 line of credit. He asked me to sit down before he explained the details. I pulled a wooden chair out from my kitchen table and sat down, staring blankly at the wall. I told him I was ready, bracing myself to hear that my son was involved in some dangerous, high-stakes gambling ring or an offshore investment scam. The reality, however, was infinitely more pathetic and infuriating. Jonathan explained the sequence. The moment the bank approved the fraudulent loan application and released the $500,000, the funds were deposited directly into a joint checking account Derek shared with Valerie. However, the money did not stay there for long. Within 48 hours, the entire $500,000 was wired into a private corporate account registered to a newly formed limited liability company. Philip had pulled the public registry documents for this specific corporation. The company was registered entirely in Valerie's name. I asked Jonathan what kind of business Valerie was operating. I knew she had a degree in art history and had never held a demanding corporate job in her entire life. Jonathan let out a heavy, tired sigh. He told me the company was registered as a luxury fashion boutique, operating out of a premium retail space in the fashionable Soho district of Manhattan. The sheer absurdity of the revelation left me completely speechless. My son had committed a serious federal crime. He had risked decades in a federal penitentiary, destroyed his relationship with his father, and stolen $500,000 of equity from my life savings. And he had not done it to pay off a dangerous debt. He had not done it to secure a lucrative, life-changing investment. He had done it to fund a vanity project for his wife. He had committed first-degree bank fraud, so Valerie could play the role of a sophisticated business owner in front of her wealthy friends. Jonathan continued to read from the forensic accountant's detailed report. The financial reality of the boutique was an absolute unmitigated disaster. The store was bleeding money at an astonishing rate. The monthly rent for the commercial space in Soho was astronomical, and the inventory consisted of wildly overpriced niche designer clothing that rarely sold. Philip had analyzed the cash flow and determined that the business had not turned a single dollar of profit since the day it opened its doors. It was a massive financial sinkhole. Valerie was using the stolen $500,000 simply to keep the lights on and maintain the grand illusion of success. She was paying for expensive marketing campaigns, hosting lavish launch parties with free-flowing champagne, and hiring public relations consultants to get her name mentioned in elite social magazines. The entire operation was nothing more than a highly expensive, fraudulent prop designed to elevate her social status among the Manhattan elite. I felt a cold, dark sensation settle deep into my stomach. I pictured Valerie standing in her beautiful failing boutique, accepting compliments from her wealthy friends, smiling for the cameras, and pretending to be a brilliant self-made entrepreneur. I pictured Derek standing proudly beside her, playing the role of the supportive, successful husband. They were both living entirely in a carefully constructed fantasy world, and I was the one footing the massive $500,000 bill. They had treated my lifelong labor, my aching joints, and my endless sacrifices as nothing more than an open credit line for their narcissistic delusions. Jonathan's voice broke through my dark thoughts. He told me that Philip had compiled a 50-page dossier containing every wire transfer lease agreement and bank statement. The documentation proved beyond a doubt that the money obtained through the forged signature had gone directly into Valerie's failing business. We had the definitive proof we needed. We had the smoking gun that connected the federal bank fraud directly to their superficial Manhattan lifestyle. I thanked Jonathan for his work and told him to prepare the final documents. I told him I wanted the forced partition lawsuit drafted immediately, along with a formal criminal complaint detailing the forgery and the wire fraud. I hung up the phone and walked over to the kitchen window, looking out at the cold, gray sky. The anger that had been fueling me for the past week suddenly crystallized into a state of absolute unbreakable resolve. I realized that confronting Derek in private would be a complete waste of time. He would simply lie, manipulate, and try to weave another intricate web of absolute deceit. He would promise to pay me back. He would blame Valerie. He would do whatever it took to protect his fraudulent image. I knew that engaging in a shouting match with a pathological liar would yield absolutely nothing but more deception. I needed to wait for the final piece of the puzzle to arrive before I could trap him in a corner he could never talk his way out of. I needed to know exactly where he rested his head at night. Fortunately, I did not have to wait much longer. The very next morning, exactly 48 hours after I had placed the initial call, my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was Richard Caldwell. I answered the phone immediately, taking a seat at the wooden table. Richard did not bother with small talk. He was a professional who knew how to deliver information with brutal efficiency. He told me he had located my son and my daughter-in-law. He said he had followed them after they left Valerie's failing boutique in Soho the previous evening. I held my breath, fully expecting Richard to tell me they were renting a modest apartment in Brooklyn or Queens, desperately trying to keep up appearances while drowning in their hidden debts. Instead, Richard gave me an address that made my heart physically skip a beat. It was a location situated in the ultra-exclusive neighborhood of Tribeca, right in the beating heart of Lower Manhattan. Richard explained that the building was one of the most prestigious, highly secured residential towers in the entire city. It was the kind of building that required a comprehensive background check and a massive amount of liquid capital just to pass the rigorous board approval process. I asked Richard what floor they were living on. He let out a low, dry chuckle that carried a heavy note of disbelief. He told me they were not just living on a standard floor. They were occupying the premier top-floor penthouse suite. I asked him how much a rental unit like that cost on a monthly basis. I assumed they were burning through the $30,000 of illicit rental income they were skimming from the Connecticut estate just to pay a Manhattan landlord. Richard corrected my assumption immediately. He told me they were not paying a single dime in rent. He had pulled the municipal property records and the title deed for the penthouse. The luxury unit had been purchased entirely in cash just 2 months prior, a few weeks before the wedding ceremony. The purchase price was a staggering $5 million. But the name listed on the official property deed was not Derek Gallagher, and it was not Valerie Kensington. The sole owner of the $5 million Manhattan penthouse was Winston Kensington, Valerie's father. I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white. I asked Richard to send me a copy of the deed and the surveillance photographs he had taken of the building. He agreed and hung up the line. A few seconds later, my email inbox chimed with a new notification. I opened the encrypted file Richard had sent over. The photographs displayed a towering skyscraper composed of sleek glass and dark steel. The penthouse featured a massive wraparound terrace that offered a sweeping panoramic view of the iconic New York City skyline. It was a residence fit for a billionaire, a titan of industry, or a highly successful hedge fund manager. It was certainly not meant for a mid-level finance employee and a failing boutique owner who were secretly begging a retired construction worker to pay a $12,000 mortgage. The twisted, brilliant architecture of my son's grand deception finally clicked into place. It was a revelation so deeply disturbing that it actually took my breath away. Derek had not just conned me. He had orchestrated a spectacular multi-layered grift that successfully manipulated two different fathers at the exact same time. The pieces of the puzzle aligned with terrifying precision. Derek needed to prove to Winston Kensington that he was a highly successful, independent prodigy capable of providing Valerie with an elite lifestyle. But Derek did not actually have the money to prove it. So he came to me. He used my lifelong savings, my impeccable credit score, and my blind parental devotion to secure the $2.5 million estate in Greenwich. Once the Connecticut property was officially secured, Derek paraded it in front of his wealthy future father-in-law. He presented the massive estate as a trophy of his own hard work and financial brilliance. Winston, thoroughly impressed by this young man who had supposedly pulled himself up from a traumatic, abusive background to purchase a multi-million-dollar country home, decided to reward his new son-in-law. Winston wanted to ensure his precious daughter had a spectacular primary residence in the city, so he purchased the $5 million Tribeca penthouse as a lavish, rent-free wedding gift. Winston firmly believed he was investing in a highly successful self-made power couple. He had absolutely no idea that the Greenwich estate, the very foundation of Derek's impressive facade, was actively being funded by the same blue-collar father Derek had viciously slandered in his wedding speech. The sheer audacity of the scheme was almost mesmerizing in its cruelty. Derek had leveraged money to impress Winston, and he had leveraged Winston's wealth to secure a rent-free Manhattan penthouse. Meanwhile, he and Valerie had completely commercialized the Connecticut house, turning it into a high-end vacation rental to generate the illicit cash they needed to fund Valerie's fraudulent fashion boutique and their luxurious international trips. And whenever the massive overhead of their fabricated lifestyle caught up with them, Derek simply forged my signature to siphon $500,000 of equity out of the property, or he picked up the phone to guilt-trip me into covering the base mortgage. They had insulated themselves in a perfect bubble of stolen wealth, funded entirely by the two fathers they were actively deceiving. I looked at the digital copy of the penthouse deed on my computer screen. I pictured Winston Kensington standing in that grand ballroom, proudly declaring to 200 wealthy guests that Derek was a financial genius who had overcome a violently alcoholic deadbeat father. Winston was an arrogant snob, but in this specific scenario, he was just as much of a victim as I was. He had been tricked into handing over a $5 million asset to a common fraudster who was currently committing severe federal bank crimes to keep his wife's vanity business afloat. A strange, icy calm washed over my entire body. The lingering pain of being excluded from the wedding evaporated, completely replaced by a surgical, emotionless clarity. I was no longer dealing with a misguided son who had simply made a few poor financial decisions. I was dealing with a parasite who had methodically engineered the financial exploitation of his extended family. He believed he had constructed a flawless, impenetrable fortress of lies. But he had made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot that I knew how to dismantle a condemned building. It was time to eat with them. I closed the email containing the penthouse deed and lowered my cellular phone onto the kitchen counter. The faint buzzing of the refrigerator was the only sound left in my modest Syracuse home. I walked out of the kitchen into my living room, leaving the lights switched off. The heavy gray skies of upstate New York cast a pale and muted glow through the front windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. I carried the manila folders containing all the gathered evidence and dropped them onto my worn coffee table. I sat down heavily on my faded couch. I spread the documents across the wooden surface, arranging them like the scattered pieces of a terrifying jigsaw puzzle. There was the luxury rental listing for the Connecticut estate, proving my son was pocketing tens of thousands of dollars every month while forcing a retired contractor to pay the base mortgage. There was the forensic accounting report from Jonathan, mapping out the exact route of the forged $500,000 line of credit that went straight into his wife's failing fashion boutique. And finally, there was the newly acquired property deed for the $5 million penthouse in Manhattan, a lavish wedding gift from Winston Kensington, based entirely on a foundation of spectacular lies. I sat in the dim lighting and stared at the paper trail of my son's extraordinary deception for the past 4 weeks. A profound, suffocating grief had anchored itself deep inside my chest. I had spent every waking moment mourning the loss of my family, agonizing over where I had failed as a parent, and wondering why my blue-collar manners were so incredibly repulsive to the boy I had raised. But as I looked at the undeniable proof of his federal bank fraud and his massive real estate grift, the heavy blanket of sorrow suddenly evaporated. The agonizing pain in my heart was entirely replaced by a startling, crystalline emptiness. I was no longer looking at the actions of a misguided, embarrassed young man who had simply gotten swept up in the glittering allure of high society. I was looking at the calculated, methodical work of a sociopathic grifter. The final, most devastating piece of the puzzle finally locked into place. I thought back to the horrific toast Winston Kensington had delivered at the wedding reception. I remembered the exact words he used to describe me: a violently alcoholic, deadbeat father who had abandoned his child. When I first heard that speech on the video recording, I believed it was simply a cruel character assassination designed to garner sympathy. But now, sitting in the dark with the financial documents spread before me, I understood the true, sinister brilliance of that specific lie. Derek did not fabricate that story merely to win the affection of his new wealthy in-laws. He fabricated that story as a necessary structural firewall to protect his entire criminal enterprise. Winston Kensington firmly believed that Derek was an independent, self-made prodigy who had purchased a $2.5 million estate in Connecticut completely on his own. If I had been allowed to attend that wedding, if I had walked into that grand ballroom and shaken Winston's hand, the entire illusion would have shattered instantly. Winston would have asked me about the house. He would have discovered that I was the actual financier of the property. Derek's carefully constructed image as a wealthy financial genius would have dissolved, and Winston never would have rewarded him with a free $5 million penthouse in the heart of Tribeca. My son had to make me a monster. He had to invent a narrative so dark and repulsive that his new family would never ever seek me out or ask questions about my existence. By painting me as a violent, abusive drunk, he ensured that I remained permanently isolated and hidden in the shadows, leaving him completely free to drain my life savings and leverage my credit score without any fear of exposure. The realization was profoundly sobering. There was no love left in his heart for me, and in that exact moment, the final lingering trace of parental devotion I held for him died completely. I did not shed a single tear. My eyes were entirely dry. I did not feel the urge to scream, to break furniture, or to call him and demand an explanation. Engaging in a screaming match over the telephone would only give him the opportunity to weave another web of manipulative lies. He would deny the forgery. He would blame the rental business on an aggressive property manager. He would invent another fake medical crisis for his wife to distract me. I refused to play his game. I refused to be a participant in his endless cycle of dramatic manipulation. I leaned forward on the couch and slowly gathered the documents, tapping the edges against the coffee table until they formed a perfectly neat, orderly stack. I was going to destroy him. I was not going to destroy him with violence or chaotic anger. I was going to dismantle his life with the cold, precise, unforgiving machinery of the law and the absolute truth. I was going to strip away every single layer of his stolen prestige. I wanted him to lose the luxury rental income. I wanted him to face the devastating federal consequences of forging a signature on a bank document. But more than anything else, I wanted to completely obliterate his social standing. I wanted to tear down the fake, glamorous facade he had built in front of his wealthy in-laws. I wanted Winston and Patricia Kensington to see exactly what kind of man they had welcomed into their elite family. I wanted them to know that the $5 million penthouse they purchased was occupied by a common fraudster who was actively robbing a grieving widower. I picked up my cell phone from the cushion beside me. I needed to orchestrate a confrontation that he could not escape. I needed a setting where his usual tactics of evasion and denial would be entirely useless. I needed an audience. If I simply confronted him in private, he would minimize the damage. I had to expose his crimes in the one place he valued above all else, right in the middle of his high society world. I opened my text messaging application and stared at the cruel, demanding message he had sent me days ago. I felt a surge of cold anticipation. I knew exactly how to lure him into the trap. Derek was driven entirely by his insatiable greed. If I offered him a massive financial reward, he would walk blindly into any room I chose. I decided I would invite him to a celebratory dinner in Manhattan. I would insist that his wife and her wealthy parents attend, framing it as a peace offering. I would promise him a substantial check. The bait would be irresistible to a man consumed by his own arrogance. I placed my cell phone back down on the table, feeling a profound sense of peace. The blueprint for his total, absolute destruction was now fully drafted. I picked up my phone from the table, the screen illuminating my hands in the dim light. I needed to craft a message, perfectly calibrated to my son's greed, so he would ignore every warning sign. I opened our thread. I typed slowly, ensuring my tone sounded exactly like the submissive father he expected. I wrote, "Derek, the banking issues have been fully resolved. I am driving to Manhattan this Saturday evening. I would like to take you, Valerie, and your in-laws out to dinner at Le Bernardin. I have a very substantial belated wedding check to give you both in person. Please let me know what time works best." I read the message twice before pressing send. It was the ultimate bait. I knew exactly what panicked calculation would take place in his mind reading those words. He spent months convincing Winston and Patricia Kensington that I was an abusive alcoholic who abandoned him. My unexpected arrival in Manhattan to host a dinner for his wealthy in-laws was a massive threat to his facade. A rational man would have fabricated a desperate excuse to keep me away. He would claim they were traveling or that Valerie was too sick to attend. But Derek was no longer a rational man. He was a deeply indebted fraudster running a failing boutique on stolen money. The mention of a substantial check would short-circuit his sense of self-preservation. He would convince himself he could manage the situation. He would tell the Kensingtons I had sought treatment for my alleged alcoholism and that I was coming to make a tearful apology and offer financial restitution. He would gamble everything, assuming I was just a clueless, desperate old man trying to buy back his love. My phone vibrated less than 3 minutes later. The speed of his reply was a testament to his sheer desperation. The message read, "Saturday at 7 is perfect, Dad. We will make the reservation under my name. Winston and Patricia are looking forward to finally meeting you." I smiled, a cold expression that did not reach my eyes. The trap had been successfully sprung. He was leading his new family right into the slaughterhouse, blinded entirely by the promise of another unearned payday. I spent the next 3 days preparing for the dinner with the meticulous precision of a military campaign. I did not intend to show up in the same outdated, ill-fitting Navy suit I had worn to the country club in Connecticut. If I was going to dismantle his glamorous life in front of his elite Manhattan family, I needed to look like a man who wielded genuine power. I drove to an upscale menswear boutique in downtown Syracuse. I spent $2,000 on a tailored charcoal gray suit, a crisp white dress shirt, and a pair of polished black leather Oxfords. When I looked at my reflection in the fitting room mirror, the weary, heartbroken construction worker was completely gone. The man staring back at me looked sharp, formidable, and utterly ruthless. On Friday afternoon, I returned to Jonathan Mitchell's law office. We needed to organize the physical evidence into undeniable, compartmentalized weapons. We sat at his large conference table and assembled 3 separate, heavy manila folders. The first folder contained the complete luxury rental logs from the Connecticut estate, highlighting the $30,000 a month in illicit income, alongside the original bank transfers, proving that I was the sole financier of the property. The second folder was dedicated entirely to the federal bank fraud. It contained the forensic accountant's detailed report, the lease agreement for Valerie's failing Soho boutique, and high-resolution, magnified images comparing my actual signature to the immaculate digital forgery Derek had submitted to the bank. The third folder was the most devastating. Jonathan had spent the week drafting a massive, multi-tiered legal assault. It contained a formal civil lawsuit for the forced partition and immediate sale of the Greenwich property. It also contained a drafted, ready-to-file criminal referral addressed directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, completely documenting the $500,000 wire fraud. Jonathan promised me that he would personally drive down to Manhattan and sit at the restaurant bar during the dinner. He wanted to be there to officially serve Derek with the civil lawsuit the moment I laid the evidence on the table. We shook hands, both silently acknowledging the absolute destruction that was about to take place. I woke up early on Saturday morning. The skies over Syracuse were clear and bitterly cold. I loaded the 3 manila folders into a sleek black leather briefcase, placed it on the passenger seat of my truck, and began the long drive south toward New York City. The journey felt entirely different than the one I had taken a month prior. There was no hopeful anticipation. There was no warm, swelling pride in my chest. My heart beat with a slow, steady, mechanical rhythm. I watched the familiar highway markers pass by, feeling entirely detached from the man who used to make this drive to visit his beloved son in college. I was driving toward a funeral. I was going to bury the memory of the boy I had raised, and I was going to make sure his new family witnessed the burial. I arrived in Manhattan just as the sun was setting behind the towering skyscrapers, casting long, sharp shadows across the bustling avenues. I navigated the heavy city traffic and handed my keys to the valet outside Le Bernardin. The restaurant was the epitome of refined, understated luxury. The lighting was perfectly dim, the carpets absorbed the sound of footsteps, and the air smelled of expensive wine and delicate seafood. It was a place designed for people who believed their wealth insulated them from the harsh, ugly consequences of the real world. It was the absolute perfect stage for a public execution. I walked through the heavy glass doors carrying my leather briefcase firmly in my right hand. The maitre d' greeted me with a polite nod. I told him I was joining the Gallagher party. He gestured for me to follow him, leading me through the quiet, elegant dining room toward a secluded semi-private alcove in the back. As we approached the table, I saw them. Derek was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled. Valerie sat beside him, draped in expensive designer clothing, a large diamond sparkling on her finger. Directly across from them sat Winston and Patricia Kensington, projecting an aura of generational wealth and quiet judgment. Derek looked up and saw me approaching. He stood up quickly, pasting a wide, perfectly manufactured smile across his face. He extended his hand, ready to play the role of the forgiving, magnanimous son, welcoming his troubled father back into the fold. He was looking at my hands, undoubtedly expecting to see a very large, folded bank check waiting for him. He had no idea that the leather briefcase I was carrying contained the permanent explosive end of his entire life. I stepped up to the table, my posture straight and my expression completely neutral. Derek stood up quickly, extending his hand with a manufactured, eager smile. He introduced me to Winston and Patricia Kensington. Winston did not stand. He remained seated in his plush velvet-upholstered chair, offering me a brief, tight-lipped nod that conveyed his absolute sense of superiority. He looked at me as though I were an insect that had somehow found its way into his exclusive dining room. Patricia offered a polite but incredibly frigid smile, her eyes darting quickly over my tailored suit. Even though I was wearing $2,000 worth of fine fabric, they still looked at me as if I had tracked mud onto their pristine carpets. They were waiting to see the pathetic, abusive alcoholic their son-in-law had described to them. They were waiting for me to break down, to grovel, and to hand over a massive check to make amends for my supposed lifetime of violent failures. Valerie sat beside her parents, looking flawless and completely bored, gently swirling a glass of sparkling water with a slice of lemon. She did not even bother to make eye contact with me as I approached. I did not shake Derek's hand. I left it hanging awkwardly in the air. I simply pulled out the empty chair at the head of the table and sat down. A waiter appeared almost immediately wearing a crisp white tuxedo jacket. He handed me a heavy leather-bound menu and politely asked if I cared to start with a signature cocktail or a glass of vintage wine from their extensive cellar. I placed the menu face down on the pristine white tablecloth. I told him I would not be ordering anything this evening, not even a glass of water, and I firmly requested that we not be disturbed for the next 10 minutes, under any circumstances. The waiter nodded professionally and stepped away, leaving a heavy, thick, awkward silence hovering over our table. The gentle hum of conversation from the surrounding diners seemed to fade away completely, leaving us in a vacuum of tension. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He let out a nervous chuckle, rubbing his palms together as a bead of sweat formed on his forehead. He leaned forward and asked if we should get the difficult conversations out of the way first so we could enjoy a pleasant family dinner together. His eyes darted eagerly down to my hands, fully expecting me to reach into my breast pocket and pull out a checkbook to fund his lifestyle. Instead, I lifted my black leather briefcase onto my lap. I unclasped the brass locks with a sharp metallic click that echoed loudly in the quiet alcove. I reached inside and pulled out the 3 heavy manila folders Jonathan and I had meticulously prepared. I dropped them directly into the center of the table. They landed with a heavy, solid thud that made the crystal water glasses vibrate and caused Patricia to jump slightly in her chair. Winston frowned, his thick silver eyebrows drawing together in deep confusion. He looked at the stark folders, then up at me, his arrogant demeanor slipping just a fraction. He asked what this was about, expecting perhaps a legal apology or a formal transfer of wealth. I did not look at Derek. I locked my eyes directly onto Winston. I told him that at the wedding reception, he had delivered a very moving and powerful speech. I told him I was particularly struck by his profound admiration for Derek's financial independence and his incredible real estate accomplishments. I slid the first manila folder across the smooth tablecloth until it rested directly in front of Winston's plate. I told him to open it. Winston cast a wary, suspicious glance at Derek, who was suddenly looking incredibly pale, and then flipped the folder open. He stared at the top document. It was the official bank transfer receipt from my retirement account, highlighting the exact sum transferred to escrow. I explained in a calm, unwavering voice that my son was not a self-made financial prodigy. I told Winston that Derek did not purchase the $2.5 million estate in Greenwich. I explained that I had liquidated my entire life savings to pay the $800,000 down payment, and that I was the legal co-owner of the property. I watched Winston's eyes widen in absolute shock as he flipped to the second page, verifying my bold signature on the master deed. The air in the alcove grew suffocatingly thin. Winston looked up, his face flushing with a sudden dark shade of red. He turned to Derek and demanded a clear explanation. He asked his son-in-law if this was a tasteless joke. Derek began to stammer, his confident facade shattering instantly into a million pieces. He threw his hands up, desperately trying to construct a lie, claiming it was just a temporary family loan that he had meant to explain later. Before Derek could spin another word of his pathetic defense, I placed my hand firmly on top of the second manila folder and slid it toward Patricia Kensington. I told them that the elaborate deception did not stop with the down payment. I explained that for the past month, Derek had been calling me in a state of manufactured panic, begging me to pay the $12,000 monthly mortgage because he claimed they were completely broke from the wedding expenses. I told them he had explicitly claimed Valerie was suffering from severe health anxiety due to their impending financial ruin. Valerie gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes darting wildly around the table as her web of lies unraveled before her parents. Patricia opened the second folder with trembling fingers. Inside were the comprehensive luxury rental logs from the online booking platform. I told them to look at the nightly rates and the fully booked calendar. I explained that Derek and Valerie had never intended to live in that Connecticut estate. I revealed that they had commercialized the home I was paying for, grossing between $30,000 and $40,000 a month in illicit rental income. I told Winston that they were actively generating massive commercial profits while forcing a retired construction worker to cover their base mortgage. Patricia flipped through the pages in silent horror, seeing the glowing 5-star reviews dating back to the very week they had closed on the house. Winston's jaw dropped. He looked at his daughter, his expression shifting from confusion to absolute disgust. He realized in that exact moment that the $5 million Tribeca penthouse he had purchased for them as a wedding gift was secured through a massive orchestrated con. They had played him for an absolute fool, abusing his trust to steal his wealth. I did not give Winston or Patricia the necessary time to fully recover from the paralyzing shock of the luxury rental logs. As Winston stared blankly at the glowing reviews, praising his daughter's fraudulent hospitality business, I immediately placed my right hand on the third and final manila folder. This was the killing blow, the absolute culmination of my entire exhausting investigation over the past several weeks. I slid it to the exact center of the long table, ensuring that both Derek and Winston had a perfectly clear, unobstructed view of its contents. I opened the heavy cover with a deliberate motion. The bright, sterile light of the restaurant illuminated the dense, highly detailed forensic accounting report, complete with the enlarged high-resolution images of my forged signature. I looked directly at Winston, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the dining room with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. I told him that his precious son-in-law was not a self-made financial prodigy. I announced to the bull that he was a federal criminal who had brazenly forged my signature on a bank document to secure a $500,000 line of credit entirely to fund Valerie's failing vanity project in Soho. Derek let out a sharp, choked gasp, as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from his aching lungs. He reached a trembling hand out toward the folder, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. Before his fingers could even graze the paper, a tall, distinguished, imposing figure stepped out from the shadows of the restaurant bar and approached our quiet alcove. It was Jonathan Mitchell. He walked with the calm, predatory grace of a corporate litigator who had won 1,000 battles exactly like this particular one. He did not introduce himself to the Kensingtons or offer a polite professional greeting. He simply stepped up beside Derek, pulled a thick stack of legal documents from the inner pocket of his tailored suit, and purposefully dropped them directly onto Derek's dinner plate. Jonathan spoke with a voice that carried absolute legal authority. He informed Derek that he was officially being served with a forced partition lawsuit, compelling the immediate mandatory public sale of the Greenwich estate. He then leaned down, resting his hands firmly on the table, and delivered the final, inescapable verdict. He notified my son that a comprehensive criminal referral complete with all the damning forensic evidence proving first-degree bank fraud and wire fraud had already been submitted to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The heavy words hung in the stale air, heavy and absolute. Winston Kensington, a man who had spent his entire life carefully curating an image of untouchable, aristocratic grace, completely lost control of his emotions. The realization that his family had been so profoundly humiliated that he had been conned into buying a $5 million penthouse for a federal felon shattered his refined, polished exterior. He stood up so quickly that his heavy velvet chair tipped backward and crashed loudly against the hardwood floor. Other diners turned their heads in shock, but Winston did not care about the public spectacle. He reached across the white tablecloth and slapped Derek fiercely across the left side of his face. The sharp, cracking sound of his palm striking my son's cheek echoed through the silent alcove. Derek recoiled, bringing a hand up to his red face, cowering backward like a frightened child. Winston then turned his blistering fury onto his own daughter. He screamed at Valerie, demanding to know how she could be so incredibly foolish and utterly complicit in such a disgusting criminal charade. He pointed a shaking finger directly at her face and declared with a voice shaking with absolute rage that the Tribeca penthouse was officially revoked. He demanded that they pack their belongings and vacate his property by the next morning, or he would have his own private security team physically throw them out onto the street. He told them they were entirely on their own to face the federal authorities and the impending criminal charges. He would not spend a single penny of his wealth to defend a common thief. Patricia Kensington was quietly sobbing into a white linen napkin, too mortified by the massive public scandal to even look at her daughter. Valerie buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the glamorous, wealthy fantasy she had built completely disintegrated around her. Derek, realizing that his powerful in-laws had entirely abandoned him and that he was now facing years in a federal penitentiary without their elite, expensive legal protection, turned his desperate eyes toward me. He pushed his chair back and literally dropped to his knees right there on the restaurant floor. The polished, arrogant finance executive was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, broken, and deeply terrified man. He grabbed the hem of my suit jacket, hot, bitter tears streaming down his face, ruining his perfectly styled appearance. He looked up at me and begged for mercy. He pleaded with me to instruct Jonathan to retract the legal documents. He promised he would pay me back every single penny with interest if I just dropped the federal criminal charges and made the investigation disappear. He gripped my jacket tighter, his voice breaking into a hysterical, sobbing whisper, crying out that I could not do this to him because we were family, and family was supposed to protect each other unconditionally. I looked down at the weeping man kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no lingering parental obligation to protect him from the harsh reality he had meticulously manufactured for himself. I gently, but firmly, pulled the fabric of my jacket out of his desperate grasp, smoothing out the wrinkles with a calm motion. I stood up from my chair and slowly buttoned my coat, maintaining my perfect, icy composure, as the wealthy patrons of the restaurant stared at the scene unfolding before them. I looked him directly in the eyes one last time, ensuring that my final message would echo in his mind for the rest of his miserable life. At your wedding, I said, my voice steady, deep, and clear so that everyone sitting at the table could hear my final judgment. You told these people I was an abusive monster who was dead to you. Today, I am just making your vicious lie a completely undeniable reality. You do not have a father anymore. Welcome to the real world, where bills are due and felons go to prison. I turned my back on the table, leaving him sobbing on the carpet. I walked out of the restaurant with Jonathan right beside me. We pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp Manhattan air. The busy city was loud, vibrant, and moving forward. I felt the heavy burden of my past sacrifices lifting from my shoulders, drifting away into the night sky. For the very first time in a long time, as I walked down the crowded sidewalk, I felt completely, undeniably, and entirely free. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and unconditional love should never mean unconditional financial abuse. As parents, we spend our entire lives building strong safety nets for our children, desperately hoping they will use them to fly. But when a child uses that net to strangle you, to fund their endless greed, and to assassinate your character for social climbing, you must remember your own worth. True parenting sometimes means stepping aside and letting the crushing weight of reality teach the lessons your money no longer can. Protecting your absolute peace and dignity is always the ultimate act of personal respect. Have you ever been completely blindsided by a family member you sacrificed everything for? How did you finally take your power back? Share your personal story in the comments below. If my revenge satisfied you, please hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss another thrilling life story.